I love big bait fishing, but unless you start to make your own, it gets very expensive very quickly. So I started making them. I started making my own master molds and then eventually my own replicas. The difference between myself and anybody else who's doing these baits on YouTube is that I have processes that are much faster. Carving wood for days, using Legos, making 2-piece master molds, taking forever to airbrush your baits. I don't have time for that stuff. I want to get out there and fish. And so I've streamlined my process and now I want to share it with everybody. And how you can make your own baits with standard tools and some spray paint and some epoxy from the store. You can just crank them out. And if you make them and you lose them, you're spending literally pennies on the dollar for whatever you'd have to keep buying. And then your possible chance that you could just make it better than everybody else. That is the much more rewarding thing. Being able to make a bait that accomplishes a task that the mainstream simply won't make. Making a bait that outperforms everything else in the season, but only you have your hands on it so nobody else can get it and burn out your spot or your techniques because you made it. And you know how to fish it. It is the ultimate system. I want to show you from start to finish my process and how easy and how fast we can bypass a lot of the other processes the mainstream YouTubers show you. Respect to all of them, they make fantastic baits, but they don't make them as fast as this. You don't need any fancy tools or wood cutting saws or any of that stuff. All you need to do is make Hobby Lobby your friend, and you can literally do all this with pretty much no problem. In this video, we're going to make a 9-inch shad glide bait. We're going to show you from start to finish how we did the master mold, to casting it, to painting it, to epoxying it, and then eventually to getting it on the water and testing it out. If you have a lot of creative talent but looked at some of the past process and thought to yourself, I don't have any time for any of that stuff, this is the video for you to maximize on your creative ability and get it done as quickly as possible so you can spend more time on the water fishing and less time cranking them out. Okay, so here was my shopping list. Got 90% of this stuff from Hobby Lobby. I got Sculpey clay, tools for it, some casting silicone and casting resin, and the stainless steel rods and the spray paint can all be found in the little hobby model car section. You'll need foam board, which is like $3 there, baling wire, which you can get from Lowe's or any sort of hardware store. You can get spray paint of any choice, but I would get the little tester spray paints they have over there at Hobby Lobby in the section. 30-minute epoxy you can find at Hobby Lobby or anywhere else. And I'm sure you all have plastic worms somewhere in your current tackle situation that you don't really care for and would like to melt down for experiment. And the Alumilite hardener, you'll have to get that separately, but that is also optional. So for starters, we're going to use clay for the entire master mold instead of wood. Because of wood's labor intensity and just overall being harder to use, and if you mess it up at all, you're kind of effed. With clay, it's much easier to use and mold, much faster, and if you mess it up, you just remold it again. I'm between projects right now, so my entire time frame to get this bait done between work and family and other extenuating obligations is probably 2 days. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of form this out. By the way, I'm going to make this one slightly detailed. I don't really think you need to make it detailed at all. It just needs to swim right. You can literally just make a bait that's shaped the right way. And as long as it swims right, you can just, use a Sharpie to put in the detail. Like draw a little smiley face on it, and it'll catch fish. In order to get the design and shape for this bait, I literally just Googled what a threadfin shad looks like, and then also what a gizzard shad looks like. And somewhere in between, we're going to come up with that. The bigger problem a lot of people have with Sculpey is that it'll mush. So you can get one side perfect, there's no guarantee that you can turn it around and do the other side as well. What I'm doing here is just making an inner core. Meaning I'm shaping it close to the way I think I want it, getting it as fairly thin as possible, because then after we bake this piece, we are going to go ahead and skin each side with a brand new layer of detail. And that's about right, it's about what we want. So we're going to go ahead and put it in a glass vase, stick it in the oven for 15 minutes at 275 degrees. And while it's in there cooking, we're going to go ahead and flatten out the rest of the clay to create the skin layers. Here it is all nice and cured and hardened. We're going to go ahead and just kind of trim it up. This is just being meticulous. But I kind of want it to look a certain way on each side. That way each skin layer will fit correctly and there's no lopsided edges. It also changes once you bake it. It loses, I think, a little bit of mass and just looks a little different than when you put it in, but it's fine. So what we're going to do now is we are going to just go ahead and flush that piece right on one side. Going to mush it in real good, get it all nice and thin, and then just literally stick it onto the already baked inner core. Now I'm going to go ahead and just cut an even 50-50 split because we need both sides to be directly even. So we're going to go ahead and carve that off. Then we'll even have a little bit of time to reshape it once we bake it again. This entire thing needs to be baked 3 times in the entire series. And this is how easy it is to actually get the detail versus carving it out. So I just use the back end of that hobby knife to go ahead and indent the eye. Now I'm just using a simple clay tool just to trace around. To get the face design, I pulled up Google of threadfin and gizzard shad, and then I also looked at some other swim baits who have the gill detail in really well. So I didn't exact direct mold replica off of those, but I did kind of look at them for guidance, so I can go ahead and get mine at least proportionate with the bait. And again, this is all pretty easy. I'm taking really no effort to carve this out, and then also smooth it on. You could also just go ahead and bake your entire piece and then carve it out like you would wood. Although it is not as forgiving as wood at that point in time, and you have to be very meticulous in how you carve it out. I find it much easier to do it while it's soft and then bake it and turn it around and then redo the other side and then bake it again when it is completely like kind of be holding up on a brace so neither end can kind of mess up or fluster out. My GoPro corrupted during the last bake, but you have to have the bait standing up on its belly. I put a screw eye on the very top of the master mold near the head and then put baling wire and made an artificial stand for it to bake that way for 15 minutes because it cannot bake. Once you have both sides carved out and put in there, it cannot bake on one side or it'll start to flatten out and it'll have problems. But before we even bake this, we're going to go ahead and make scales. Scales take forever to carve into wood, especially millie and small scales like what a shad has. We're using butterfly net, and we're slightly pressing into all the smooth end of where the bait was, making sure not to touch the details of the face. After primering this, I realized I could have pressed it in a little harder, so I took note of that, and check out this gill that I did. That's with a loofah. Instead of taking hours, maybe days to carve and sand something like this, I did this probably in about an hour, maybe less. Pretty easy. Before this, I made 2 master molds of different shad types. They swim completely different and they're for different purposes. This one that I'm trying to make now needs a wider profile, but it needs to be lighter than my bottom shad down there. That way it will glide deeper and kind of stay afloat, may stay suspended a little bit better versus the other one. I suspect it'll be around 9 inches once it's completely done with the tail. Here's the inside core. I primer over these to look for defects. If I find defects, I'll reshape and remold. JB Waterwell, which is a quick dry epoxy, like little putty stuff, like for plumbing. I just use it to touch any sort of my clay molds up in a situation like this where I need to do a little bit more fine tuning. I'm just a little bit meticulous about this, but it fits good. We put screw eyes in. You can get screw eyes from lurepartsonline.com or on eBay. And you can also get them from Home Depot or any hardware store. They're just not going to be stainless. If you can find stainless screw eyes in a hardware store, you're lucky. Right now I just have basic ones in there to make sure that the bait will pivot on both sides equally. And I'm going to get the sort of glide I want. And then I just reprimed over the back end to check to see if it's okay. And I'm using the tail from that other bait since I destroyed it to see how this is going to look and if I can use the same kind of profile tail. Since it all looks like it's going to work really well, we're going to go ahead and use that foam board, that $3 foam board we got. We're going to get a hot glue gun and some glue sticks. We're just going to go ahead and cut pieces out and make our own little box. We're going to make this a one-piece mold. It's going to be 2 parts, but the molds for each, the front and the tail, are going to be just one piece. And then we're going to tactfully cut it after we put it all in there. To suspend these in place, which is normally why people do 2-piece molds, so the mold can be completely centered, they'll make the mold so it can cast on one side and then they'll flip it over and do it another time, but that's too long. I don't have time for any of that. I need this thing done in a day. So how we're going to do this is we're going to take baling wire, put it tactfully through the foam board, and once it's through the foam board, remember to glue around it, or the silicone mold will start bleeding out of those holes. But we put 2 on the bottom to brace it, and then we'll put 2 on each side of the mold to kind of pin it in place. My GoPro corrupted, so you can't see that, but that's what I did, and did that for both sides. Now this is Aluminite High Strength 3 silicone mold, and that is right from Hobby Lobby. Use their 40% off coupon, and it's a pretty good deal. You could also just get it directly from their site in bulk, like get like 5 gallons of it. And I just like mass hoarded these over time, and got one here, got one there, in between my little art projects. And fun fact, when these molds wear out, you can cut them into little blocks and cubes and then reuse them into brand new mold. That way you're not constantly burning through brand new mold. It actually saves a lot of money that way. So that's what we're doing. Pouring it in spurts, we're mixing a pound of it at a time, and then sticking it in. We just do the same process and repeat until you have enough mold over each piece to be comfortable with the outcome. We need maybe about a 1/2 inch or so, 3/4 if you want to be really meticulous, about 3/4 inch over the actual mold, so when you cut it, it stays formed in one piece really well. Now we wait a whole afternoon. I think the cure time is like 12 to 18 hours. So this is where we're back the next day, and here we go. We're back the next day, but overall amount of time spent into making the master mold and then molding it in silicone is only about a few hours. So we're gonna go ahead and just speed this up, take it out of the foam board, and draw templates where we want to cut, and then label each side so we don't forget. Do this very tactfully. For the tail, you want to cut straight down, and then right towards the very back, right where the tail creases, you want to cut to the side. You want to do that so you leave the mold and the tail intact. That way when you go to pour, the tail will not be distorted. Now if you cut straight down in the middle of the tail, you would have a distorted tail. It would either be too big or whatever, and I've done that. Didn't work. So you got to cut around the very back of the tail if you're going to want this one-piece mold to work. Otherwise, it won't. You're also going to have to cut little air chambers every so often throughout the side, but before we even do that, let's go ahead and pull this out and see how the inner side came out. You might have to struggle a little bit to get it out, but just be careful because it is clay. I probably could have cut that forward a little more. And now, I know when I'm like showing you these molds, I realized after like reviewing and editing them what they look like. And I want you to know that is not my intention, and nothing I do here is meant to be perverted at all. That's just how it looks. Sorry. Anyways, you do the same thing for the front. And we're only trying to cut maybe about 25 to 30%. We're trying to leave the other 60% intact. You really only want that much out. Cut. And you want everything else because when you do that, the smoother finish your mold will be. Less cleanup and less distortions to the overall mold, except for the very top and obviously in the middle. But the distortion to the middle doesn't really matter because that's where your bait joins. These are the air chambers I'm talking about cutting out. You gotta cut one specifically for the pour, and then every so often where you think air might collect, when you pour in the resin, you need to make a slight little beveled chamber right here. We're just doing that in a little triangle, cutting right up from the top into where the mold is, and that should help bleed out any of the air pockets so you don't have any mold distortions. I think I've got a pretty good spot here where it'll bleed out all the air. If it doesn't bleed all the air and I get air pockets inside the resin mold, then I'll just spread it out more and cut more little air vents. We're using baling wire for pretty much everything else. It does great job for keeping the molds together. You know, I've seen a lot of people use rubber bands. How miserable. Also, for the weight, you can get like ballasts that are really expensive, but I'm using a piece of spaghetti and some egg sinkers from the tackle shop. And then later on, I dish the spaghetti all together and just use fishing line. You're gonna have to mess with weights. Weight is like maybe the bigger issue with doing your whole thing. You have to test that and retest that. Just get a 5-gallon bucket of water and make sure it floats even. And we'll talk about how that's supposed to go here in a little bit. Right now, we are using micro balloons, which is also really cheap for a 5-gallon bucket. It's like 20 bucks. And that will distort the density of your resin to make it either more dense or less dense. And that will adversely affect the sink rate and the overall weight of the lure. And again, I do not mean for any of this to look that way. That's just how it looks. Please don't leave any perverted comments in my comment section because that's bad. Demold time is 15 minutes. The resin gets super hot, so don't take it out too fast. It'll also mess up things if you take it out too fast. The overall cure time for the mold once it's completely out is, I think, about a few hours, possibly into the next morning. It's completely and fully hard. But while it's cooking there, you might as well make as many as you possibly can. So right now, since I'm in a bait making mood, I'm just making all kinds of different molds. I mold about 3 or 4 different baits, some crucial ones that I want to try out. So we're just gonna go ahead and check them out. This one's already done. I'm pretty excited because this is gonna see where any of the defects are, if there are defects at all. But see that section where we cut around the side of the tail? That's why. So the tail comes out perfect. Otherwise, it's not going to come out perfect. Pretty good. I do have one big giant air pocket up there. So that what I did for the next mold is I just cut it up further and then I made a little air vent. But this came out pretty well. Just going to go ahead and clean it up. And then we're going to go ahead and forward that a little bit more. And then we're going to go ahead and cut another air vent. Now let's see how the front came out. The back came out fairly well. The back is maybe the more tough one. The front is generally pretty pain-free because it's just, it's not too much to it. Doesn't have a tail crease, doesn't have this, doesn't have that, doesn't have a giant beveling edge. So the cleanup is very minimal with this too. Where all the bait is distorted, when you do a 2-piece mold, there is very, very little of the bait that's actually as distorted. And the bottom is more or less perfect every time with 0 distortions. The scales came out pretty good. Always relook over your mold because any fingerprint or any sort of nick will show up in the mold at least 2 or 3 times worse than it shows up in your master mold. So just know that. When you cast it, any little detail stays in there. That one is good enough for government work. This one is my older shad that the mold's still good. So we're going to go ahead and recast a few of these. This one's a little heavier. And it swims like a tank. It doesn't jerk off or do anything or spin around. You can swim it any way you want. The only thing is it just doesn't glide as deep, and it sinks a little faster than I want. But this one's pretty nice too. We're gonna go ahead and run 2 of these along with pretty much everything else that I have out there. We're gonna go ahead and paint them, and that is the next section of this whole thing, the painting. Oh yeah. I forgot to show you the screw eyes and the pin. So in the master mold, there's these little divots that I have from the initial marks where I put the screw eyes in. I got these from Lure Parts online. Sometimes you can find them in bulk else places, but you really got to be specific on the sizes. They come in all different shapes and sizes and lengths. I like the smaller ones. They seem to do just as well as the larger ones. When I have an excessively big bait, then I have to use larger screw eyes. You can get these from the hardware store also quite a few times. In fact, I think some of these actually are from there because I couldn't get the size I wanted to do the job that I needed to do for the Lure Parts online place. There's actually my smaller shad. My GoPro file corrupted when I was doing the other one, but I do have it here to show you on this, and it's just pretty much the exact same process. Screwing them in there, and with every little screw and every little tweak, or tailoring of those screw eyes, the back tail kind of moves a certain way. So you gotta kind of back them in and out and make sure they're kind of tuned so you get even swim on both sides. That's a bigger thing. Can it swim does the tail move evenly on both sides? You tune the screw eyes until they do. And then you very, very carefully take a drill and then you pre-drill the holes. So you have a bunch of pilot holes everywhere, because if you do try and just like openly just pushing the screw eyes or force them in or torque down on them, they will break off in your bait and that'll pretty much ruin your bait. That will ruin the mold. And that is miserable. You have to kind of throw it away or modify it in some way to where it's going to accept the additional weight, and you'll still have your hook spot in a reasonable place. Now thinking about it and looking at this, I probably should have used a punch or something to kind of mark in a little better versus kind of just winging it with that drill. So just FYI. You should also be able to get split rings from your local tackle store. I think they even have them at Walmart. Just depends on your Walmarts. You can also order them online as well. These are like 80 or 90 pound split rings because the fish they hit out here are pretty heavy and ruthless, and they'll just rip off split rings and bend out your hook if you don't watch it. Now we're on to painting. I just want to show you that little section. You can either use primer or an adhesion promoter. People use both, get fair results. I'm using an adhesion promoter here. I likely will be using primer later on. Now we're using silver paint, like the Rust-Oleum mirror finish stuff. I think that's what it is. But it's over there in the craft section, the Hobby Lobby section. And we're always spraying a base coat. For this one, we're going to spray a black base coat because that's going to end up being a carp, and we want the scales to pop in the middle. But this is all spray paint. That was all big giant can spray paint. I would love to take the little time that it would take constantly tweaking and modding and cleaning out an airbrush, but I don't have time for that crap. I don't. I have a little bit of time here and there to do this. I know what colors catch fish. I know what patterns need to be there. I put in all that detail, so I wouldn't have to put in a whole lot of detail painting, and that's the beauty of putting in the detail painting if you care to know. But the more detailed your mold is, the less sophisticated the paint job has to look. I mean, you have some people that are doing exquisite, intricate detail into the mold and then exquisite paint jobs, but that better be their full-time job, or they better have nothing else going on in life after that, because that just takes forever. And again, pretty much the entire series, if you haven't gotten it, is ain't nobody got time for that stuff. Here we are with the gold. This is the Rust-Oleum gold, like mirror finished gold spray paint. We're painting it from an angle, that way we don't cut into the back side of the scales. That way the black still pops out. We are allowing anywhere from like a half hour to an hour. It depends on whatever the dry time says on the back of the spray paint. Pay attention to that, because that's real. So when it says to coat within, 1 to 4 hours, you have to wait an hour for that stuff to dry. You have to wait for the initial layer to like dry completely, or your entire paint job will be botched. You also have to watch the coating. And the better stuff that I really liked were the testers. The testers, tiny little spray paint cans, they were a little bit more precise. You can get the bigger spray paint cans, they kind of just throw a bunch of paint all over it, and you have to, if you get too much on one side, you have to repaint it. It's a pain. So I just get the little tester spray cans, and they have a bunch of different colors I really like. Like this one came out pretty nice, and that was with 2 or 3 different types of paint. Pretty aggressive on the top, and then a yellow belly and some other stuff. The only thing left is to really epoxy these, and you can do that one of 2 ways. If you want your epoxy to dry correctly, you will need an epoxy drying setup, and we'll show you that here in a second. Or you can just get Aluminolite UV resin, and that stuff you don't need to make any sort of apparatus. They could just hang like that in the sun or in an air dryer, anything with like UV light, and they'll cure, and they look pretty good. So it's just up to you. Because I needed an epoxy dryer, I made this out of PVC, like a rotisserie barbecue motor that I bought off eBay, and some scrap wood I had around, and then I kind of just made these apparatuses to hold the bait out of some of the screw eyes and some, you could have done this really out of anything. In fact, I could have done it way smarter, but it does give all the baits an even turn. That way the resin cannot run and like try and separate and make your bait look terrible. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to make the tail. So normally people, how they make nice advanced tails is they go ahead and do the entire process that we did for that fish and mold a tail. I don't have time for that crap. I literally just want to make a tail really quick. I'm using plastisol, which is pretty much just rubber worm cubes, just not formed yet. They make for DIY bait making stuff. Or you can just get a bunch of rubber worms in a bag of your choice and color and heat them up just like this. Heat them up for, 30 seconds here, possibly a minute the first time, and then you want to keep shrinking down the intervals, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, to get a certain consistency. But once it's all kind of melted into a section, you can actually pour and just use it like that. I'm going to go a step further. I have this Aluminite hardener for plastic hardener to make your stuff, and it works really good. It looks like Elmer's glue though. I'm going to do an experiment later and see if Elmer's glue will toughen up the stuff just like this. And if it does, then I will let you know. But right now, the Aluminite plastic hardener is the only thing that is really not sold at Hobby Lobby that you might have to order from an outside source or from the Aluminite website themselves. So here I am, I keep stirring, I keep trying to get the desired consistency. Later on, I just figured, why don't I just put it right on the microwave plate? That way it will melt evenly and flat and just give me the flat layer I need. Because literally all I need is for it to flatten out, just like how it is. I actually cooked it about 5 seconds too long, so that's where you can see it started to discolor. But that's alright, it's going to look okay. But just know that's how tedious. You gotta really shrink the time as it moves up, especially when you put in that hardener. The stuff will burn a little easier in the microwave. The microwave is really the best, and maybe I don't know how else you would do it, but I just did it out of a microwave, put it right in the pan, it flattened it out, and that's perfect. So let's go ahead and mold this thing out, cut it out. So after looking at what a shad tail looks online, I kind of get these pieces off. I'm going to lay them there. One piece is a little bit thicker than the other, and that one's going to ultimately be the one that I'm going to use. I can use the other thinner piece for smaller baits. I'm just going to go ahead and draw a tail. And I'm going to cut it out, and I'm going to use it as a template to cut a tail into that plastic. And just cut it out and make sure it fits. So now that it fits, I want to add some detail to it. And how we're going to do that, we're just going to get a soldering iron. Or in this case, I have a foam cutter, which is going to give me a little bit, it's going to give me the ability to make my lines a little bit straighter, easier because the rod's so thin. But a normal soldering iron will do this just fine. Little soldering iron from Harbor Freight. Just cut little grooves in your tail like that. That's how I'm doing it. I'm sure now that you guys see this, some of you will come up with something very cool. And I can't wait to see that. But yeah, here it is. Okay, now that we know it's going to look good, we're going to go ahead and just stick it in there. Some people put pins in their tails, and I used to do that. And then I realized it was a giant waste of time because when you super glue it in there, it does not come out. And if it starts like coming loose, like it'll give you signs before the entire thing comes out, you just re-super glue it. But super glue seems to be a phenomenal thing. I also super glue the middle pin that holds the bait together. I put super glue around the top and bottom of the pin so it doesn't end up shaking out and causing you problems. Just gotta give it a nice even run, and obviously watch your fingers. Later on, we go ahead and color it with a marker, just to give it a tint. I like the way this thing came out. Pretty good, right? In testing this thing, it does exactly what I need it to do. It does a much deeper glide, and it suspends for a lot longer, so it stays in place a lot longer. And so this is much better for catching like the large lethargic bass or the very picky striper. It also catches people, like my friend Richard here. I don't have a whole lot of media to show you, but it does catch fish, and it does do a very good job. Can't wait to get a launch on this thing and set my own personal best. Hope you do the same with your bait, guys. Take care.